Three trains collided inside a mountain tunnel in northern Spain. Hundreds of passengers were suddenly trapped in darkness as twisted metal and shattered rail cars filled the confined space. Smoke poured through the tunnel, and rescuers struggled for hours just to reach the wreckage buried deep inside the mountain. But what happened after the disaster may be even more disturbing, because when the Spanish government reported the official death toll, the number seemed impossibly low. Fewer than 100 victims, they claimed. Yet many historians believe the true number may have been far higher. Tonight, on Track 13, we're looking at the story of the Torre del Bierzo disaster, the train crash Spain may have tried to hide. The disaster occurred on March 3, 1944, during a difficult period in Spain's history. Only a few years had passed since the end of the Spanish Civil War, and the country was still struggling to rebuild its infrastructure. Railways were among the most important lifelines connecting towns and cities. But years of conflict had left many railway systems overworked and poorly maintained. Spain was also under the authoritarian rule of Francisco Franco, whose government tightly controlled the press and the flow of information throughout the country. Despite these challenges, trains continued to run across Spain's mountainous northern regions, carrying both freight and passengers along winding rail lines carved through valleys and mountains. One such line passed through the province of León, near the small town of Torre del Bierzo. The railway there wound through steep slopes and sharp curves, passing through a series of tunnels blasted directly into the mountainside. Among them was a long tunnel stretching more than 500 meters beneath the rock. Inside these tunnels, steam locomotives created an especially dangerous environment. Thick smoke and exhaust would quickly fill the enclosed space, and visibility could drop to almost nothing. Once a train entered the tunnel, it essentially disappeared into darkness until it reached the other side. On the afternoon of March 3rd, a freight train known as Train 421 began descending through these mountains. The locomotive was pulling a heavy load of freight cars, many of them filled with coal. As it began its journey down the steep grades leading toward Torre del Bierzo, the crew inside the cab had no reason to believe anything unusual was about to happen. But within minutes, something began to go wrong, and before long, the crew would realize they had lost control of the train entirely. As Train 421 descended through the mountains, the engineer noticed the train was gradually gaining speed. At first, this wasn't unusual. Gravity often helped trains maintain momentum on downhill sections of track. But when the engineer attempted to slow the locomotive by applying the brakes, the response felt weaker than expected. He applied more pressure. For a moment, the wheels gripped the rails, and the train slowed slightly. Then the weight of the freight cars behind the locomotive pushed the train forward again. The braking system wasn't holding. Inside the cab, the engineer and firemen quickly realized they might be facing a serious problem. The train was carrying a tremendous amount of weight, and the downhill grade was growing steeper as they approached Torre del Bierzo. The engineer attempted to apply the brakes again, this time pulling harder on the controls. Still, the train continued accelerating. At that moment, the crew understood what was happening. The brakes had effectively failed. The freight train was now racing downhill, with little chance of stopping before reaching the tunnel ahead. What the crew did not know was that another train was already inside that tunnel. Passenger train number 9 had been forced to stop inside the tunnel due to delays on the line. The train carried hundreds of passengers traveling between towns in northern Spain. Inside the carriages, people waited patiently for the journey to resume, unaware that a runaway freight train was rapidly approaching their location. Moments later, Train 421 thundered into the Torre del Bierzo tunnel. Inside the enclosed space, the locomotive's headlights struggled to cut through the smoke and darkness. The engineer pulled the emergency brakes with all the force he could muster, but the massive weight of the freight cars continued to drive the train forward. Then suddenly, the outline of another train appeared ahead. There was no time to stop. The freight locomotive slammed into the rear of passenger train 9 with tremendous force. The impact crushed several of the rear passenger cars instantly, and the violent collision sent shockwaves through the rest of the train. Passengers were thrown from their seats as wooden rail cars splintered and collapsed under the pressure. Steam pipes burst, filling the tunnel with thick clouds of vapor and smoke. In the darkness, survivors struggled to understand what had just happened, but the disaster was about to become even worse. Further down the line, another passenger train, train number 12, was approaching the same tunnel. Because of communication failures along the railway, the crew of Train 12 had no warning that a catastrophic collision had already occurred ahead of them. As they approached Torre del Bierzo, the signals did not stop them in time. Moments later, the locomotive entered the tunnel and crashed directly into the tangled wreckage of the first collision. Within seconds, 3 trains were piled together inside the mountain tunnel. The confined space amplified the chaos. Steam locomotives continued hissing violently as smoke and toxic gases filled the air. Passengers scrambled over twisted metal and broken wood in desperate attempts to escape through shattered windows and damaged carriage doors. For many people trapped inside the tunnel, there was nowhere to go. Rescue workers from nearby towns quickly rushed toward the scene, but the conditions inside the tunnel made rescue operations extremely difficult. Thick smoke and dangerous gases filled the confined space, forcing many rescuers to retreat repeatedly just to breathe fresh air. Survivors who managed to escape described scenes of confusion and panic inside the wreckage, where injured passengers struggled to find their way toward the tunnel entrances. It took hours before rescuers could fully reach the center of the disaster. When they finally did, the scale of the tragedy became clear. Entire carriages had been crushed or flattened by the collisions. Bodies were scattered throughout the wreckage, and many passengers had been trapped beneath collapsed rail cars. Official reports eventually stated that around 80 people had died in the disaster. But almost immediately, doubts began to emerge about that number. Passenger trains in Spain during the 1940s were often severely overcrowded, with travelers packed into carriages well beyond their intended capacity. Because of this, many historians believe the actual number of victims could have been far higher than the official reports suggested. Normally, a railway disaster of this magnitude would trigger a major public investigation. But Spain, in 1944, was governed under strict political control. The Franco regime maintained tight censorship over newspapers and radio broadcasts, and stories that reflected poorly on government infrastructure were often minimized or suppressed entirely. As a result, only limited details about the Torre del Bierzo disaster were published at the time. Many official records surrounding the crash later disappeared, and historians attempting to reconstruct the event decades later discovered that key documents were missing or incomplete. Several important questions remain unresolved. How many passengers were truly aboard the trains that day? How many victims were actually killed inside the tunnel? And what exactly caused the freight train's braking system to fail so catastrophically? Some railway historians believe the brakes overheated while descending the steep mountain grade. Others suggest that wartime shortages and poor maintenance may have contributed to the mechanical failure. Communication failures along the railway line likely played a role as well. At the time, many railway operations still relied on manual signaling systems and dispatch coordination, leaving room for human error. Together, these factors created a disaster that may have been both preventable and poorly documented. Today, trains still travel through the mountains near Torre del Bierzo, passing through the same tunnels where the disaster occurred in 1944. Most passengers traveling the line today have no idea that one of Spain's deadliest railway accidents once took place there. There is no large monument marking the disaster, and for many years, the story remained largely absent from public memory. Yet among railway historians, the Torre del Bierzo disaster continues to raise troubling questions, not because the crash itself is impossible to understand, but because so much of the truth may have been lost or deliberately hidden. Some researchers believe the real death toll was several times higher than the official figures reported at the time. Others suspect that parts of the investigation may have been quietly removed from government archives. What is certain is this. On March 3, 1944, 3 trains collided inside a mountain tunnel in northern Spain. Hundreds of lives were forever changed, and the full story of what happened that day may never be completely known.